Smoke choked the air of the spire of Ethelgard's inner sanctum. Kaelin Thorne exhaled slowly, the breath rattling against the silence of the dead. At his feet lay the first wave of armored insurgents, their armor sheared cleanly. He tightened his grip on the stolen ceremonial blade, blood dripping from its edge, waiting for the second wave to breach the doors. What happens when a dying empire invites a builder to their world, only to realize they just armed a weapon? For months ago, his greatest tactical challenge was adjusting the stiff collar of his diplomatic uniform. He had stood before the high altar, completely unarmed, offering his bare hand to Archon Selene in a marriage built on mutual distrust. The spire of Ethelgard offered no warmth to strangers. Kaelin learned that on his first day as the Archon's husband. He walked the vast, vaulted corridors with measured steps, ignoring the sneers from the Astrari court. They saw only a terrestrial diplomat, a soft man from Terra sent to formalize a fragile peace treaty. They severely underestimated him. He was a bridge builder. That was the lie he repeated every morning. In the privacy of his isolated quarters, he would uncap a silver-lined flask of terrestrial bean brew, letting the bitter, earthy scent ground him. He would share a cup with the silence, forcing his mind to forget the kinetic geometry of close-quarters combat. He spent a decade becoming a weapon and a lifetime trying to forget how to use it. Now, he memorized complex Astrari etiquette instead of patrol routes. A sharp clink of crystal. It happened at the solstice banquet. Baron Malachar, a towering Astrari with combat scars lining his jaw, deliberately knocked Kaelin's glass across the table. The hall went completely still. Archon Selene sat rigid beside Kaelin, her eyes tracking the insult. Malachar sneered, loudly questioning the martial worth of a man who carried no weapon. The Baron wanted a reaction. He wanted to fan the sparks of a nascent insurgency and prove Terra was weak. Which meant the Baron was probing for an excuse to break the treaty. Kaelin felt the familiar cold hum of adrenaline in his veins and the immediate instinct to break the Baron's windpipe in 3 precise moves, but he simply smiled and offered a protocol-perfect apology in flawless Astrari instead. The most dangerous man in the room is the one who chooses not to fight. The biological cost of suppressing that reflex was immense. The human adrenal system floods the body with cortisol and epinephrine during a threat, and forcibly restraining that kinetic energy causes violent microtremors in the extremities. Kaelin simply hid his shaking hands beneath the heavy fabric of the table, offering nothing but a polite nod to the man actively trying to end his life. True power was demonstrated through the choice to withhold violence rather than the act of it. If you want to see how long a trained killer can play the pacifist, join us as the cracks begin to show. The real test came 3 days later on the jagged moon of Voros Prime. The traditional royal hunt was meant to be a display of Astrari dominance, a ceremonial bloodletting to satisfy the old guard. Kaelin was invited as a formality, handed a standard heavy spear, and deliberately placed at the extreme rear of the hunting party. The terrain was steep and unforgiving, shrouded in a thick chemical fog. Their target was the Voros Maw Fiend, an apex predator renowned for its asymmetric hunting patterns and impenetrable dorsal plating. And the Astrari royals left him behind. It wasn't an accident. The hunting party intentionally shifted their formation, creating a gap in the defensive line. They wanted the terrestrial diplomat to face the wilderness alone. They expected him to panic. They expected him to die. Silence. Kaelin stopped walking. He felt the subtle shift in air pressure before he heard the scrape of claws against stone. The Maw Fiend dropped from the crags above, a blur of muscle and teeth, bypassing the main party entirely to strike at the isolated human. Kaelin didn't run. He didn't scream. He simply pivoted. The weapon in his hand was primitive, but lethality was never about the tool. It was about the perfect symmetry of the strike. As the beast lunged, he dropped to one knee, angling the spear upward with terrifying precision. He let the creature's own momentum drive the heavy wooden shaft through its armored underbelly, snapping the beast's spine in a single, fluid motion. The massive predator collapsed at his feet. Archon Selene broke through the tree line a moment later, her weapon drawn, eyes wide as she scanned the brush for a mangled corpse. Instead, She found him standing quietly over the carcass, his breathing perfectly even, wiping alien blood from his hands. She looked from the dead creature to the mild-mannered diplomat she had married. The illusion of the soft terrestrial shattered in the damp air of Voros Prime. Beneath the spire's grand concourse, the Foundation groaned. The illusion of the harmless diplomat shattered on the moon, but the reality tore open 3 weeks later. A marriage signed in ink, but tested in the blood of a dying empire. Warlord Von's insurgency didn't formally declare war. They simply detonated the primary plasma conduits during the High Council session. Kalen felt the shockwave compress his ribs before the warning klaxons even started screaming. Dust. He tracked Celine through the ensuing chaos, dragging her behind a collapsing marble pillar as heavy kinetic rounds shredded the ancient throne. She was shouting desperate orders to deafen guards. Kalen didn't shout. He was already calculating the insurgency's breach vectors. They were hitting the main gates with heavy ordnance, which meant it was a clumsy distraction. The real target was the mountain fortress holding Lady Lyra, the key to the Loyalist voting bloc. "They're taking the ridge," he stated. His voice was entirely devoid of the diplomatic warmth he'd painstakingly practiced for months. He grabbed a shattered communications relay from a bleeding guard. In under 3 minutes, he bypassed the Astrari military encryption and organized an elite terrestrial extraction squad from the embassy's shadow detail. The lethal Black Ops protocol he swore he'd left behind was suddenly the only currency that mattered. They moved through the subterranean maintenance shafts. It was dark, cramped, and smelled sharply of scorched circuitry and ozone. Kalen took the point position, stripping away the heavy, restrictive diplomatic robes to move faster. He found a discarded Astrari ceremonial blade in a ruined lower armory. The weight was entirely wrong, the balance too heavily skewed toward the ornate hilt, but it would cut. He didn't need the weapon to be perfect. He just needed it to be fast. They hit the fortress sublevel with terrifying momentum. The extraction was surgical. Kalen watched his terrestrial team secure Lady Lyra in a kinetic bubble, their movements a brutal ballet of efficiency that made the elite Astrari guards look like slow-motion targets. But Von's personal guard caught them at the primary fallback point. Kalen ordered the squad out immediately. He stayed behind alone to buy them the 90 seconds they needed to reach the extraction shuttle. Smoke choked the air of the inner sanctum. He stood exactly where he had frozen earlier, bloodied ceremonial blade in hand, the first wave of armored insurgents already dead at his feet. The second wave didn't breach the heavy doors. They blew the entire wall open. Kalen didn't brace for the impact. He moved directly into the blast wave. The sensory input was overwhelming, the shriek of tearing metal and the blinding flash of plasma fire. He slipped inside the lead guard's reach. A brutal strike to the knee joint, a rapid pivot. The ceremonial blade found the vital seam in the neck plating. Warlord Von stepped through the burning rubble. His dual-phase sabers ignited with a sickly, oscillating hum. Von expected a prolonged duel. He expected a traditional display of Astrari martial pride and posturing. Kalen gave him a terrestrial execution. Von lunged. Kalen stepped inside the lethal arc, ignoring the searing heat that blistered his shoulder. He drove the heavy pommel of his blade into Von's wrist, shattering the bone instantly, and swept the warlord's legs out. The dual sabers clattered onto the polished stone. Kalen pressed the edge of his blade against Von's throat just as the facility's power core began a terminal, shuddering collapse. "Yield," Kalen rasped. The extraction shuttle brought them back to the surviving wing of the ruined palace hours later. Kalen sat heavily on the edge of his bed, his muscles locked in deep exhaustion. He reached for the silver-lined flask of terrestrial bean brew resting on the nightstand. It wasn't a quiet ritual of peace anymore. It was a vital tourniquet for a fractured mind trying desperately to step back from the edge of war. Archon Celine stood frozen in the doorway. She didn't look at him with gratitude. She watched the way his bloody hands stopped shaking the exact moment he took a deliberate breath, her posture rigid, her eyes wide with the stark realization that she was watching a weapon simply put itself back to sleep. "You could have taken this entire world on your first day," she whispered, her voice trembling. He unscrewed the battered flask in the heavy silence. What happens when the Empire's greatest bridge builder is the one holding the match? The fallout continues next time.